The auctioneer hadn't even finished his sentence when Maeve Holloway raised her hand and bought every single one of them. 47 old sows that nobody wanted, animals the town had already written off as fit for nothing but the rendering barrel. People laughed. Not quietly, either. They laughed the way people do when they think they're watching someone destroy themselves in real time. She was 29 years old, alone on a Rocky Mountain farm, and she had just spent the last of her inheritance on livestock every experienced rancher in the county had rejected. What they didn't know, what she barely knew, was that she had just made the most important decision anyone in that valley would make for the next 50 years. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this reaches. Hey. The morning of the auction was cold, in the particular way October mornings got cold in the high country. Not bitter yet, but carrying a warning in the wind that came down off the ridgeline just before sunrise. Maeve Holloway drove her father's wagon into Callaway Flats, with a canvas coat pulled tight across her shoulders, and her jaw set in a way that people who knew her recognized as trouble or stubbornness. Most of the time, those two things looked identical on her face. She tied the horse at the post outside Dunner's feed store and walked the half block to the stockyards without looking at anyone directly. Though she was aware of being looked at. She was always aware of it. Had been since her father's funeral 3 months earlier, when she had stood at the graveside without crying, and people had decided that meant something unflattering about her character. The truth was simpler. She'd done her crying in the barn the night before, where nobody could see it, and nobody could offer her condolences that she'd have to pretend to appreciate. The auction yard smelled of hay and manure, and the particular nervous energy of animals that knew something unfamiliar was happening around them. Maybe 50 men stood in clusters near the fence. Ranchers, a few merchants, 2 men from the county assessor's office, who showed up at every public event and never seemed to buy anything. Clay Mercer had claimed the best position along the rail, naturally. He always did. He was 52 years old and owned more land in that county than the next 4 largest holders combined, and he moved through public spaces with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once been turned away from anything he wanted. Maeve found a spot near the back corner where she could see the animals in the pen without being directly in anyone's sightline. She pulled out a small notebook, her father's habit, one she'd inherited, and wrote down what she saw. 47 sows. Older stock, that was obvious. Some of them had been through 8 or 9 litters, their bodies thickened and heavy-shouldered in the way of animals that had worked hard and lived long. 2 had ear notches she recognized as Harlan Greaves's breeding marks. A few others came from the Duchamp place up near Timber Creek. She wrote their approximate weights, their gait as they moved in the pen, the quality of their bristle, and the set of their eyes. Then she put the notebook away and waited. The auctioneer was a lean man named Fossey, who chewed tobacco and talked with the rapid professional blur of someone who had been doing this exact job for 30 years and could do it in his sleep. He started with the young breeding stock, which went briskly. Then the feeder pigs, which caused a minor bidding war between Mercer's foreman and a buyer from down the valley. Then the 2 draft horses, which went to a logging operation out of Bent Creek. Then Fossey gestured at the 47 sows. He opened at $4 a head. Nobody moved. He dropped to 3. Silence. Mercer was openly examining his boot. One of the county assessor men coughed. $2.50. Boys, Fossey said, and there was a particular weariness in his voice. These are legitimate breeding animals. They've produced. They're sound. They're done producing, someone called from the crowd. Laughter. $2 a head. Somebody take the lot. Maeve raised her hand. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded her bid. That earlier silence had been the silence of disinterest. This one was the silence of people turning to look at something they couldn't immediately explain. The Holloway girl, someone said quietly. Not unkindly, exactly, but not kindly either. Fossey recovered his professional composure faster than the crowd did. $2 a head, 47 animals. That's $94 to the lady with the notebook. Anybody want to top that? Clay Mercer turned and looked at her. His expression wasn't mocking. That came later from the others. His was more like the expression of a man trying to calculate something and finding the numbers didn't add up. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the animals in the pen. Us. The drive home took 2 hours with 47 sows moving behind the wagon in a loose, grudging procession that her borrowed stock dog managed with surprising competence for an animal that had never worked pigs before. By the time she turned up the road toward the farm, the cloud cover had moved in from the west, and the first real cold of the season was settling into the hollows. The farm was called Holloway's Place by everyone in the valley, though her father had called it something else privately. The operation, he'd say, with a kind of self-deprecating humor about the gap between what it was and what he had intended it to become. Robert Holloway had been a man full of intended things. He'd read widely and thought carefully and kept notebooks full of observations about soil and climate and animal husbandry that he'd never quite assembled into a workable practice. He had died at 61 from a stroke that came on a Tuesday morning while he was mending fence, and Maeve had found him lying face down in the pasture grass, one hand still holding the wire tool. She had buried him, settled the account she could settle, and then sat with his pile of journals for 3 evenings straight, reading everything he'd written in 30 years of trying to understand this particular piece of ground. Most of it was practical. Observations about frost dates, notes on grass varieties, assessments of different stock purchases. But there were other pages, written in a smaller and more careful hand, that were different in character. Pages where he had written about flavor, about the relationship between what an animal ate across its whole life and what it eventually tasted like, about old Spanish ranching practices he'd read about in a book he'd ordered from a bookseller in San Francisco, about something called montanera, the practice of driving pigs into oak forests to finish on acorns, a tradition so old that nobody quite remembered where it had started. The flavor lives in the fat, he had written. The fat lives in the feed. The feed lives in the land. You cannot separate these things and expect to get them back at the end. She'd read that passage 4 times. Then she'd thought about the 47 sows that were going to go to the rendering house if nobody bought them. Animals that had lived long, that had eaten variously, that had accumulated something in their bodies that younger, corn-fed stock hadn't had the time to develop. Her father had never tested his theory. He'd written about it, researched it, circled back to it in journal after journal, but he'd never actually done the thing he was describing. He'd run out of time, or money, or some combination of the two that she understood better than she wished she did. She had driven to that auction knowing what she was going to do. She hadn't let herself think about it too carefully, because careful thinking had a way of talking her out of things that needed to be done. She got the sows settled into the lower pasture that first night, and stood at the fence in the dark for a while, listening to them move through the grass and adjust to the new space. The stock dog sat beside her with his head tilted, observing the situation with the professional skepticism of an animal that had opinions. "I know," she said. He didn't look reassured. Inside, she lit the lamp and spread her father's journals on the table. Not all of them. The relevant ones, the ones with the passages she'd marked with slips of paper. She also opened the notebook she'd been keeping herself, which had started as a way to continue his records and had gradually become something different, something more argumentative and specific. Her theory, or her father's theory, finished by her, was this. The old sows had something in them that younger animals didn't. Not in spite of their age, but because of it. Years of varied feeding, of movement, of reproducing, of accessing different plant species across different seasons. All of that had built a complexity in their muscle tissue and fat that no amount of short-term grain feeding could replicate. Corn finished fast. Acorns finished slow. Wild apples and native roots didn't finish at all, in the conventional sense. They just kept adding complexity, adding depth, adding the kind of flavor that you couldn't manufacture with shortcuts, because it wasn't a product of any single thing. It was a product of time itself. The problem was that nobody in this valley, nobody in any valley she knew of, had tested this with a smokehouse operation specifically designed to bring that quality out. You could raise the most remarkable animal in the world and ruin everything in the last 12 hours if you didn't know what you were doing. She turned to a page in her father's later journals. One of the last entries before his handwriting had started to change in the way it did near the end. He had written about a man he'd met once at a stockmen's gathering in Sacramento, a Basque immigrant who had worked with the great Spanish ham producers as a young man before coming to California. The man had described the smoking process in a way that her father had set down in careful, almost reverent detail. The temperature curves, the wood selection, the hanging time. the relationship between the animal's fat composition and the smoke absorption rate. Her father had drawn diagrams. She had studied those diagrams until she could reproduce them from memory. The first week, she built the routine that would sustain her through everything that followed. She woke before dawn and spent the first hour checking the fence lines and the lower pasture where the sows ranged. She was releasing them onto the oak-covered hillside in managed groups, not all 47 at once, which would have been chaos, but in smaller groups that she rotated every few days, giving each section of the hill time to recover. The oaks on the lower slope were mixed black and valley oak, and this time of year they were dropping acorns in quantity. She'd also identified 3 locations where wild apple trees had gone feral along old fence lines, probably planted by some earlier homesteader who hadn't lasted. There were service berries along the creek. There was a grove of wild plum near the upper spring. She kept records. Every morning, which animals in which section, what they had access to, their general condition and behavior. She wrote down which sows came to her readily and which were still suspicious, which ones moved purposefully toward the acorns and which seemed to prefer the grass. She noticed that the 2 grieve sows with the ear notches were the most assertive foragers, moving with a directness that pushed the younger animals out of their way. And she made a note to watch them as a kind of quality indicator. Animals that had been raised well tended to forage well, and she was going to need that information later. The second week, a man named Torrance Kipp rode up her road on a gray horse and waited in her yard until she came out of the barn. Kipp worked for Clay Mercer as a kind of general manager, which in practice meant he delivered messages that Mercer didn't want to deliver himself. "Mr. Mercer wanted you to know," Kipp said, "that he's got a buyer coming up from Stockton in about 6 weeks who's looking for finished sows. If you want to sell what you bought at auction, he'd be willing to arrange the introduction. Take them off your hands before the real cold hits, and you're trying to winter 47 animals on that pasture." Maeve was cleaning a harness buckle. She didn't stop. "Tell him I appreciate the thought. He'd make you whole on what you paid. Might even come out a little ahead." "Tell him I appreciate the thought," she said again. Kipp looked at the hillside where she could see 3 of the sows moving under the oaks, dark shapes against the dry grass. "Miss Holloway," he said, not unkindly, "those animals aren't going to grow fast enough to matter before spring. That hill won't carry them through deep winter." "I'm aware of the hill's limitations," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Kipp." He rode away. She went back to the harness and the buckle and the particular kind of thinking that was less like planning and more like listening to the rhythm of what she was trying to do, which required quiet to hear properly. The smokehouse was behind the main barn, built by her father's father from flat stones hauled up from the creek bed. It had been functional once, but Robert Holloway had used it only sporadically, and it had fallen into a state that was less than ideal. A gap in the roof where water had come in over several winters, a damaged damper assembly, mortar crumbled between the lower stones on the north wall. She had assessed it carefully in the weeks after her father's death, adding it to the long list of things that needed attention. Now she added it to the shorter list of things that needed attention immediately. She started on the roof repair the second Saturday of October, working alone because she couldn't afford to hire anyone. She pulled the damaged shake sections and replaced them with cedar she'd split herself. She'd learned to split shake from her father at 13, and she still did it with an efficiency that would have surprised people who assumed she couldn't manage a fro. The work took 2 full days and left her hands cracked and sore in the way that outdoor work in autumn air always did, the skin drying faster than it could repair itself. The damper was more complicated. The original mechanism had seized with rust, and she spent an evening trying to free it with oil and heat before deciding the cleaner solution was to fabricate a replacement. She knew enough basic blacksmithing, again, her father's curriculum, which had been comprehensive if sometimes impractical, to do the metalwork herself, but it required a fire in the shop forge and 3 hours of trial and error before she had something that moved properly. While she was working on the smokehouse, she was also cutting and splitting wood. Specifically, she had identified what she wanted: hickory from the stand on the east slope, some apple wood from the dead limbs on the feral trees, and a smaller proportion of oak. Her father's journals included a passage about the man from Sacramento and the wood mixtures he had described. The particular qualities of different woods at different combustion temperatures, the way certain combinations produced smoke that penetrated without overpowering, that colored the fat a specific amber red without forming the bitter crust that high-heat smoking produced. She cut and split and stacked in the lean-to beside the smokehouse until she had what she calculated she would need for a first test batch, plus extra. She would not use the sows for testing. Testing would happen with smaller cuts from a young pig she'd kept back from the spring litter, a more ordinary animal, fed in a more ordinary way. If she ruined the test pig in the smokehouse, it was a setback. If she ruined one of the 47 sows after months of careful feeding, it was a different kind of catastrophe. In November, the first hard frost came, and with it the end of the easy acorn crop. She had planned for this. She had spent part of September and all of October gathering, not just observing the animals gather, but gathering herself, filling sacks with acorns from the sections of the hill that the sows hadn't accessed, storing them in the barn where they'd stay dry. She mixed the stored acorns with the buttermilk she'd been getting at a reduced price from the Olsen dairy operation 2 miles east. Old Sigrid Olsen had looked at her with a particular kind of Scandinavian skepticism when Maeve explained what she wanted it for, and then said nothing and offered her a fair deal. The supplemental feeding changed the daily routine. Each morning, she wheeled a barrow of acorns and a bucket of buttermilk out to the distributed feeding stations. She'd built 6 of them across the pasture and hillside so the dominant animals couldn't monopolize the supply. She watched each station for long enough to get an accurate picture of intake, recorded it, and adjusted. The sows were changing, not in the way grain-fed animals changed. That was a visible inflation, a rapid filling out that looked like progress but always resolved into a certain texture in the final product that she had always privately found coarse. What she was seeing was subtler, a deepening. The animals were moving differently, with a kind of settled weight that wasn't fat exactly, but wasn't muscle exactly either. It was the combination that her father's journals kept circling around, the layered composition that only developed with time and varied feeding. She weighed them roughly every 2 weeks, using a makeshift scale arrangement she'd rigged from her father's equipment. The numbers were humbling. They were not gaining weight at anything like the rate that a grain operation would produce. A conventional operation would have animals ready for market in 3 months. Her animals, at their current pace, would take until early spring at the soonest, and some of them longer. She knew this. She had known it from the beginning. She wrote it down anyway because writing it down made it a fact instead of a fear. The first snow came in early December, and with it came Dorothea Price. Dorothea was 60 years old and had lived alone on a 40-acre homestead at the end of a rough road 3 miles northwest of Maeve's farm since her husband had died of the fever 8 years earlier. She was a woman of extremely few social graces and a great deal of practical competence, and she arrived at Maeve's door on a Tuesday morning with a jar of pickled beets, a look of frank assessment, and no preamble. "Heard you bought Greaves's old sows at the Callaway auction," she said. "Among others," Maeve said. "Greaves raised good animals. Didn't know what he had." Dorothea looked past her into the kitchen. "You eating enough? You look like you've lost weight." "I'm fine. Do you want to come in?" Dorothea came in. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the journals spread across it and the notebooks stacked beside the lamp and the diagrams tacked to the wall above the cold stove. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Your father's research," she said finally. "Yes, I knew about some of it. He talked to my husband once, years back, about the Spanish pig practices. Theodore thought it was interesting but impractical." She turned one of the journals toward her and read for a moment without asking permission. "What are you using for smokewood?" "Hickory and apple, mostly. Some oak." "Hickory runs hot. That's why it's the smaller proportion." Dorothea looked at her directly for the first time. "Have you run a test batch yet?" "Not yet. The smokehouse damper assembly was wrong. I've been working on the temperature calibration." "What are you aiming for?" Maeve showed her the diagrams. Dorothea studied them for several minutes in silence, one finger moving along the temperature curves her father had drawn. "These are close to what the old German butchers in Sacramento used," Dorothea said. "I apprenticed with one for a summer when I was 17. My father thought it was a ridiculous thing for a girl to do." She set the journal down. "It wasn't ridiculous." "No," Maeve said. "I can help you with the smokehouse calibration." She said it the way practical people in the hill country offered things. Not as charity, but as a straightforward transaction between people who both understood the value of what was being offered. "I'd appreciate that," Maeve said. So Dorothea became part of the operation. Not in any official capacity, not with any formal arrangement, but as a presence that showed up 2 or 3 times a week and contributed knowledge that had nowhere else to go. She knew about hanging temperature and humidity. She knew about the relationship between pre-salting duration and smoke penetration. She had opinions about wood ratios that were based on actual experience rather than theory, and those opinions proved more useful than half the diagrams on the wall. Maeve wrote down everything Dorothea told her. She added it to the journals, clearly attributed alongside her father's passages and her own observations, building something that was becoming more than any one person had intended. January was the hardest month. The cold was sustained in a way that made outdoor work a different kind of effort. Not impossible, but costly. The body spending energy on warmth that it couldn't spend on other things. She developed a pattern of layering that would have looked eccentric to anyone who saw it. 2 pairs of socks, her father's old wool coat over her own, a hat he had made from a piece of elk hide that she wore pulled down over her ears until it was so dark in the morning that she needed it off to see properly. The Sows were managing. They had access to the covered section of the lower barn during the coldest nights, and she checked them before dawn and after dark to make sure nobody had gone lame or injured themselves in the dark. 2 of the older animals had developed joint stiffness in the early cold snap. She'd adjusted their supplemental feeding and added more dry bedding, and they had come through it. She ran her first test smoke in January. The young test pig was a 22-week animal, ordinarily fed, nothing special. She butchered it herself in the early morning cold, working with the efficiency she'd developed over a lifetime of helping her father with this task. And then she prepared 3 different cuts for the smokehouse: a shoulder, a middle section, and a ham. She had calibrated the smokehouse through 3 test fires without meat, adjusting the damper assembly until she could hold temperatures within a narrow range. Dorothea had come for 2 of those tests and suggested 3 specific adjustments, 2 of which Maeve had implemented, and 1 of which she had modified into something that worked better on this particular stone structure. The first smoke ran for 16 hours. She barely slept. She checked the temperature every 40 minutes through the night, keeping a small fire burning in the kitchen so she could return to warmth between checks. She wrote down every reading. She wrote down the wood consumption rate, the changes in smoke density and color as the fire settled, the shift in the way the smoke smelled as it matured. In the morning, she pulled the cuts. They were not right. The shoulder was close, very close actually, with the kind of color and exterior texture that her father's diagram suggested. But the ham had dried unevenly, and the middle section had taken too much smoke, developing a bitterness at the surface that she recognized immediately as the consequence of running slightly too hot in the first 4 hours before the fire settled. She wrote it all down. 3 pages of notes, specific and unsentimental. She had learned this from her father. The most important thing you wrote down was the failure, described precisely, because vague memories of success were useless, but exact records of failure were navigable. She did it again 2 weeks later. Better. The ham still had the uneven drying problem, which she traced to airflow on one side of the hanging configuration. She rebuilt the hanging arrangement, adding a cross brace that redistributed the spacing, and tested it in the 3rd smoke. The 3rd smoke was in February. This one was right. Not perfect. She wasn't reaching for perfect, but right in the essential way. The temperature curves held within range. The smoke color ran the amber blue she was looking for through the middle hours. The hang was correct and the airflow even. When she pulled the cuts in the morning and cut into the shoulder, the interior color was what her father's diagrams had described, and the smell was something she had never encountered from any smokehouse she'd visited before. She stood in the cold smokehouse with a piece of that test shoulder in her hand and understood, for the first time, that the thing her father had spent 30 years approaching from every angle was actually real. It wasn't theory, it was food. What? The sows were nearly ready by the time March arrived. Not all of them, and not all at the same rate. She had been assessing them continuously throughout the winter, and she'd identified 12 animals that had reached the composition she was looking for based on her father's criteria and her own developing eye. The others were still building. She decided to start with 8. She spent 3 days preparing the first 8 animals, working methodically and carefully, using the complete process she had developed across the winter's tests and failures. The butchering, the preparation, the salting process that Dorothea had helped her calibrate, and then the smoke. The smoke ran for 22 hours. She didn't try to sleep this time. She sat on a stool in the barn doorway with a lantern and her notebook and monitored and wrote and thought. Around 3 in the morning, when the fire had settled into its long middle phase and the smoke was running at the color she wanted, she allowed herself to feel something close to confidence. Not certainty. She wasn't built for certainty, but the particular certainty-adjacent feeling that comes from having done a thing carefully enough times, that you begin to trust the process. When she pulled the product in the morning, she knew. She cut into the first ham and looked at the interior cross-section, the marbling, the fat distribution, the color gradation, and she recognized what she was seeing. It matched her father's diagrams. It matched the Basque man's description as her father had transcribed it. But more than either of those things, it matched something she had no document for, something that was purely her own judgment, built from 5 months of work and failure and adjustment. She cut a small piece and tasted it. She stood there in the cold morning light of the smokehouse for a long moment. Then she sat down on the wooden bench along the wall and put her face in her hands. Not crying, not exactly, but something that occupied the same territory, the release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Her father had been right. He had always been right. He just never had the time to prove it. The same week she finished the first batch, a freight driver named Owen Rusk stopped at her farm to water his horses. He was heading north with a delivery for a hotel in Mineral Springs and was behind his schedule and not particularly interested in conversation. But Maeve was carrying product to the barn for storage when he arrived, and he smelled it from 30 feet away and stopped walking. "What is that?" he said. She looked at what she was carrying. "Smoked pork." "From here?" "From here." He looked at her with the expression of a man revising an assumption. "Could I—" He stopped. "What do you get for a piece of that?" She named a price that was higher than the going rate for smoked pork in Callaway Flats by a significant margin. He didn't argue. He bought a section of shoulder without further negotiation, paid her in coin, and loaded it carefully into his freight wagon alongside whatever else he was carrying. He was at the farm for 11 minutes total, including the time his horses drank. She didn't know what would come of it. She went back to work. A week later, she got a letter. It was from the chef at the hotel in Mineral Springs, a man named Harlan Fourchette, who wrote in a cramped and precise hand that the freight driver had brought him something he could not explain and that he would like to understand better. He asked if she was selling, what quantities she could supply, and what she was asking. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she wrote back. The response from Fourchette led to a conversation that led to a visit. He came down himself, taking a hired coach from Mineral Springs to Callaway Flats, and then negotiating a ride out to her farm with a reluctant local. He was a short man in his 40s with the kind of hands that had done real kitchen work and an attitude of absolute seriousness when it came to food that Maeve found both refreshing and slightly alarming. He walked through the pasture and the hillside with her, asking questions in a rapid-fire style that assumed she had the answers, which she did. He wanted to know everything: the feeding regime, the acorn varieties, the buttermilk source, the smoke wood, the salting process. She told him what she was willing to tell him, which was most of it, because she had decided that secrecy wasn't going to be her competitive advantage. Her competitive advantage was the animals, and the land, and the time. Those things couldn't be copied quickly, and by the time someone tried, she intended to be so far ahead that it wouldn't matter. "What you're doing," Fourchette said, standing on the hillside and watching 4 sows root deliberately through the dry grass under an oak, "is what the Spanish producers do, what the Italians do, what the old European producers have done for hundreds of years. Nobody in this territory is doing it." "I know," she said. "This will not stay unknown for long once word moves." "I know that too." He looked at her with the kind of professional respect that she had not received from many people in the last 6 months, and that she accepted without showing how much it mattered. "What are you able to supply? Starting when?" She opened her notebook and showed him the numbers. He looked at them. He looked at the notebook's other pages, the records, the weights, the observations, the temperature logs. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Holloway," he said carefully, "I want to bring someone else to see this. A man I work with in Sacramento, a buyer who supplies 4 hotels and 2 of the larger restaurants on the Pacific Coast. She nodded. He will want more than you can currently produce. I'm aware. He will likely offer to invest in expanding your operation. When that conversation happens, she said, I'll have it. Right now I'd like to discuss what I can actually supply and at what terms. Fourchette smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. Of course, he said. They went back to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table with the journals and the notebooks spread around them, and they talked business for 2 hours, surrounded by 30 years of her father's thinking and 5 months of her own. While outside, the late winter light moved across the pasture and the 47 sows. 47 minus the 8 she'd processed, 39 still building toward something, moved steadily through the dry grass toward the oak line, doing the slow and necessary work of becoming what they already were, one careful day at a time. The letter from Fourchette arrived on a Thursday, and by Friday morning the whole of Callaway Flat seemed to know about it, which was impossible, since she hadn't told anyone, but which was also entirely predictable because nothing in a town of 400 people stayed private for longer than 48 hours, regardless of how carefully you guarded it. She was at Dunner's feed store buying oat bran when she heard her name in the kind of sentence that was designed to carry. Holloway girl's got some hotel man coming out to look at those old sows she bought. This was from a rancher named Pettis, speaking to no one in particular from the corner where he stood with 2 other men she half recognized. Must be desperate for novelty. Or she sold him something sight unseen, the second man said, and now he's coming out to figure out how to get out of it politely. Pettis laughed. That'd be about right. Maeve paid for her oat bran, picked up the sack, and carried it out to the wagon without looking in their direction. This was not because she hadn't heard them. It was because she had learned, somewhere in the last 6 months, that certain conversations didn't deserve the energy of a response. Her father had been different. He'd engage with anyone, argue cheerfully, hold his ground with a kind of good humor that left even his opponents feeling respected. She didn't have that particular gift. What she had instead was a capacity for ignoring things that didn't serve her, which was a different kind of discipline, but a useful one. She loaded the sack and drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon with the animals. The 39 remaining sows were settling into the rhythms of late winter foraging with the purposeful calm of creatures that had adjusted to their circumstances. She had reorganized the pasture rotation after the first batch, moving the animals through sections in a sequence that gave each area recovery time and maximized their access to the different feed sources across the property. The upper section near the second spring had wild garlic running through the grass, and she'd noticed that the sows who spent time there developed something particular in their fat, a subtle sharpness underneath the richness that she thought was interesting but needed to be controlled. Too much wild garlic, and the flavor tipped. The right amount layered in something that Fourchette, during his visit, had stopped mid-sentence to think about. There's something here I can't name, he'd said, cutting a piece of the first shoulder test she'd given him. Wild garlic, she'd told him, from the upper spring pasture. I've been managing the exposure. He'd looked at her. You're managing garlic exposure in open pasture animals. I'm managing grazing rotation, she said. The garlic is part of what's in the rotation. He hadn't said anything else for a moment, just cut another piece and ate it slowly. She thought about that look sometimes when she was up at the spring pasture in the early morning, watching the sows move through the damp grass. It was the look of a man encountering something that operated on a different level than what he'd expected. She found she needed to be careful not to let it become too important to her. Approval from the right person, offered at the right moment, had a way of becoming a thing you worked toward instead of a thing that arrived naturally. And work done to earn approval always showed somehow, in the final product, as a kind of calculation that didn't belong there. She was building something that had to come from its own logic, not from anyone else's expectations of it. Fourchette brought his contact in the 3rd week of March, and the man was nothing like what she'd prepared herself for. His name was Theodore Aldous, and he was from a family that had been in the Pacific Coast provisioning business for 2 generations, which meant he had grown up in warehouses and knew what things cost before he knew what they tasted like. He was 48, broad across the shoulders, wore good boots that had seen real work, and had the slightly flattened affect of a man who had been presented with too many hopeful products by too many hopeful people over too many years to risk showing enthusiasm too quickly. He didn't say much on the walk through the property. He looked at things carefully. The animals, the pasture condition, the oak density on the hillside, the spring water source. He asked 3 questions in an hour and a half, How many animals were currently in the program? What was her projected processing timeline? And what was the feed cost per animal through the complete cycle? She answered all three without hesitation, because she had the numbers in her notebook and had been running them in her head for months. In the smokehouse, he cut pieces from two different sections of the first batch. The shoulder that had been stored properly in the cold room for 3 weeks now, and one of the hams. He ate both in silence. He asked for a second piece of the ham. He stood there chewing it with his eyes slightly unfocused in the way of someone paying close attention to something that isn't visible. Then he looked at her and said, "What do you need?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like the opening line of a conversation he'd decided they were going to have. "Right now," she said, "I need to know what you can move and at what price, because that tells me what timeline I'm working with for the next round." He named a price per pound that was higher than she had asked for Shet. She kept her face neutral. "For what volume?" "Everything you can produce consistently for the next 18 months. After that, we renegotiate based on what the market's doing." She thought about the 39 animals, the ones still building, the additional sows she'd been quietly identifying at neighboring farms, animals that other ranchers had written off, older breeding stock being carried at cost toward the rendering house. She'd had conversations with 3 different owners, preliminary ones, testing the ground. "I can commit to 2 batches before summer," she said. "After that, I can give you better numbers." 2 batches gets me through the season at 3 locations, Aldous said. "I need 4 locations minimum by fall." "Then we're negotiating a longer timeline." He looked at her steadily. "You're not going to make promises you can't keep." "No," she said. "Good." He picked up his hat from the bench where he'd set it. "Most people in your position would have told me whatever I wanted to hear." "Most people in my position aren't actually in my position," she said. "They're trying to get to a different one as fast as possible. I'm trying to build something that works." Aldous looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he put his hat on. "I'll take the 2 batches at the price I named. We'll talk again in June." The arrangement with Aldous should have felt like a turning point, and in a practical sense it was. It represented the first real revenue stream, the first proof that the operation could sustain itself financially beyond the immediate term. But the weeks after his visit were some of the hardest she'd faced, because turning points in the abstract don't solve the material problems that persist underneath them. The main problem was labor. She was doing everything herself, and the second batch required more than one person could reasonably manage at the processing stage. Dorothea helped when she could, but Dorothea was 60 years old and had her own 40 acres to maintain, and there was a limit to what could be asked without the arrangement tipping from mutual exchange into something that resembled exploitation, which Maeve refused to let it become. She had to hire someone. The problem with hiring someone was money she hadn't collected yet for products she hadn't delivered yet, which created the particular arithmetic of early-stage operations that her father had described in his journals as always building the bridge while standing on it. She had enough from Aldous' advance payment, he'd paid a third up front, which she hadn't expected, to cover one person's wages for 6 weeks. She thought about who to ask. The answer, when it came to her, came the way answers sometimes did. Not through deliberate reasoning, but through the accumulation of small observations clicking into alignment. It was the Vasquez family. Ramon Vasquez worked intermittently as a day laborer at various farms in the valley, and was considered reliable by everyone who had used him, though he hadn't found steady work in 2 seasons because the larger operations had cut back and the smaller ones couldn't commit to regular wages. His wife Celia had grown up on a hog farm in the southern part of the state and had mentioned this once in passing conversation at the general store, in the casual way that people mention things they don't expect to matter. Maeve had written it down. She rode out to the Vasquez place on a Wednesday morning in late March. It was a small property, a rented house with a kitchen garden and a lean-to for their 2 horses. And Celia was hanging washing when Maeve arrived. Ramon was out somewhere. Celia looked at her with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly and accurately. "I'm Maeve Holloway," she said. "My farm is on the East Road, past the old Duchamp Junction." "I know who you are," Celia said. She didn't say it unfriendly. "I need help with a processing batch. 6 weeks guaranteed, more if it works out. I'm paying $10 a week plus a proportion of the product." She paused. "You grew up working hogs." Celia had the clothespin in her hand and she was looking at Maeve with the expression of someone recalculating something. Where'd you hear that? You mentioned it once. Once? Celia repeated. You remembered. I keep notes. A pause. The wind moved the washing. Somewhere in the house, a child made a sound and went quiet. What kind of operation? Celia asked. Slow raising, acorn and pasture feed, cold smokehouse, extended hang time. She hesitated, then added, It's nothing like the conventional production. Celia looked at her for a long moment. I'll come and see it. She came the next morning. She walked through the whole property the same way Fourchette and Aldous had, but differently. They had been assessing the product. She was assessing the work. She asked questions about the feeding rotation, the manure management, the water situation, the smokehouse ventilation. At the smokehouse, she opened the damper assembly herself and looked at the mechanism Maeve had fabricated and said, Who built this? I did. It's a good fit. She ran her finger along the edge of the plate. My father always said the damper was the most important part. Nobody ever believed him. Your father was right, Maeve said. Celia closed the damper. $10 a week and proportion. I'll bring Ramon for the heavy work. He doesn't know hogs the way I do, but he learns fast and he doesn't complain. Ramon gets the same terms as you, Maeve said. That surprised her. She showed it briefly and then put it away. All right, she said. Clay Mercer came to see her himself in early April. She had been expecting something from Mercer for weeks, not because she'd been watching for it, but because the Valley's information network was comprehensive enough that she understood he would know about Aldis's visit, about the arrangement, about the fact that something on the Holloway place was operating at a level that the town's original assessment of it had not accounted for. Mercer was a man who paid attention to information, and this particular information required a response from him. He came alone, which she respected. No Torrance Kip this time. No intermediary. He rode up the road on his good bay horse at 11 in the morning and dismounted at her fence and waited, hat in hand, until she came out of the barn. He was 62 now, she noticed. Looked it more than he had in the fall. There was something in his posture that had changed. Not diminished exactly, but less effortlessly certain, as if some calculation he had always relied on had recently given him an unexpected result. Miss Holloway, he said, I was wondering if we might talk. We can talk, she said. They stood at the fence because she didn't invite him in, not from hostility, but from a preference for keeping the conversation brief and in the open air where it couldn't expand into something longer than it needed to be. He looked past her at the pasture, at the sows moving in the middle distance. I was wrong about what you were doing, he said. She waited. I thought, most of us thought, that you were making a sentimental decision, keeping your father's animals, spending money you didn't have on something that wouldn't return it. I know what you thought, she said, not harshly. I've got 14 older breeding sows that I've been carrying through the winter, waiting on a buyer that isn't coming. He said it without ceremony. They're sound animals, good lines. I was planning to sell them for rendering. She looked at him. What kind of lines? 4 of them are out of the Whitfield stock I bought 6 years ago. The others are mixed, but all solid foundation animals. He named 3 farm sources she recognized as reliable. What do you want for them? He named a figure. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. Mercer always priced things fairly because he understood that his reputation was worth more than any individual transaction. I can take 8 of them now, she said. The other 6 when I have the pasture space. Probably 6 weeks. He nodded. The Whitfield 4 are the ones you'd want first. I'll take the Whitfield 4 and 4 others you select. The selection matters. You know these animals. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to name, something between respect and the particular discomfort of a man encountering competence where he hadn't expected to find it. I'll pick the best ones, he said. I know you will, she said. I'd want you to. He put his hat back on, started to turn his horse, then stopped. Your father, he said, not looking at her directly. Robert. I argued with him once about soil management. He was right, and I didn't admit it. She didn't say anything. He was a man who deserved better from this valley than he got, Mercer said. She held that for a moment. It was the most difficult thing he'd said, harder to receive than the livestock negotiation, because it was the kind of acknowledgement that arrived too late to be useful and too genuine to dismiss. "He would have appreciated hearing that," she said finally. "I appreciate it for him, Jim." Mercer rode away down the road. She stood at the fence for a minute after he was out of sight, her hand on the post, thinking about her father. Not the grief version of him. She'd done that work already mostly. The specific version of him that existed in those journals. The man who had spent 30 years circling an idea he never quite reached, who had been right about the fundamental thing and had not lived to know it. She went back to the barn. By the middle of April, the second batch was into its final stages, and the Vasquez operation was running with the kind of established rhythm that she had hoped for but hadn't been certain of. Celia worked with the focused quiet of someone who had grown up understanding that livestock work had its own pace, and that efficiency was a matter of intelligence rather than speed. She and Maeve had developed a language of small gestures and half-sentences that communicated the necessary information without the overhead of full explanation. Ramon was exactly what Celia had described. He learned fast, and he didn't complain, and he had a physical endurance that transformed the heavy work of the operation. Dorothea continued to appear 2 or 3 times a week, and the 3 women developed an overlapping system of knowledge: Celia's practical hog experience, Dorothea's smokehouse history, Maeve's theoretical grounding from the journals. It wasn't a formal arrangement. Nobody had called it a team or given anyone a title. But the work moved better than it had when she was alone, and the product reflected it. The second batch was 10 animals. She had selected them from the remaining 39 with even more care than the first 8, spending a week of close daily observation before committing to which ones were ready. 3 of the Mercer sows had joined the program, and 2 of them were already showing the kind of composition she was looking for, which told her that Mercer had been right to recommend them. The Whitfield line was exceptional stock, and whatever they'd been fed before they arrived at her place, the genetics were responding to the new regime the way good genetics did. The smoke on the second batch ran 24 hours. She and Celia traded the monitoring shifts through the night, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, and the fire held its range with a stability that the earlier batches hadn't achieved, partly because of accumulated experience, partly because the wood was cut and dried to a more consistent moisture content than what she'd worked with in January. The temperature logs for the second batch were the most precise she'd produced, and she wrote a full analysis the morning after, comparing every stage to the first batch and to her father's ideal diagrams. The second batch was better. Not dramatically better. The first batch had been good, genuinely good. But there was an additional consistency in the second, a more even distribution of the marbling, and a cleaner edge to the smoke character that she attributed primarily to the wood consistency and the improved hang spacing Celia had suggested. It was the kind of difference that a casual consumer might not identify, but that Fourchette and Aldous absolutely would. She wrapped the product carefully for transport and sent word to Aldous that delivery was ready. His response came back in 4 days. He was sending a wagon for the full batch, and attached to the confirmation was a short note that said simply, "The hotel in Sacramento wants to know when they can expect regular supply. Name your terms." She read it at the kitchen table with Celia sitting across from her drinking coffee, and she passed it over without comment. Celia read it, set it down. "Sacramento," she said. "Yes. That's a larger market than Mineral Springs. Considerably." Celia looked at her. "How many animals would you need for regular supply to Sacramento?" "More than I currently have in the program." "More than you can carry on this land alone?" "Yes." A pause. Outside, Ramon was moving 2 of the newer sows to the upper pasture, the sound of his voice carrying faintly through the wall in the tone that meant he was talking to the animals, a habit he'd apparently always had, that the animals responded to better than silence. "There's a widow 2 miles north," Celia said. "Edna Pruitt. Her husband ran pigs before he died, and she's been selling off the property piece by piece to make the tax payments. She still has the land, or most of it, but no stock and no money for stock." "I know the property," Maeve said. "I've driven past it. The oak coverage on the east hillside is—" She stopped. "Good coverage." "It's better than good," Celia said. "Ramon worked there for a season. He said the acorn drop was heavier than anywhere else in the valley." Maeve thought about the Sacramento note, about Aldis's 4 locations, about the Mercer animals that were still building, about the gap between what she could produce alone on this farm and what a genuine supply relationship with a Sacramento hotel required. "I'd need to talk to Mrs. Pruitt," she said. "She'd listen," Celia said. "She's not a woman who turns away practical conversations." Maeve folded the note from Aldous and put it in her notebook. She had a habit, when a conversation indicated a next step, of writing it down immediately, before the momentum of the moment passed into intention and dissolved. She wrote, "Pruitt Land, East Hillside Acorn Coverage. Visit this week." Then she wrote, "Don't move faster than the animals can sustain." She underlined the second line. It was something her father had written in one of his middle journals, in the context of a different decision, but it applied here with the same weight. The Sacramento note was good news. It was the kind of news that could, if you weren't careful about it, make you start reaching for the next thing before the current thing was solid. She had watched other operations fail that way. Good foundations undermined by premature scaling, quality stretched thin by the hunger to be larger faster. She was not going to do that. She was going to visit Edna Pruitt and look at the land and think carefully about what a genuine expansion required and what it cost, and whether the cost was the right cost to pay at this particular moment. And she was going to write all of it down, the way her father had written things down, because writing things down forced honesty about the difference between what you wanted and what was actually in front of you. Outside, the spring light was moving across the pasture in the way it did in April, when the angle of it finally started to carry warmth again. The last of the original 47, 21 animals still building toward their season, still working through the oak-covered hillside with the patient purpose that she had come to find, in some quiet part of herself, genuinely moving. They didn't know what they were building toward. They were just doing what they did, eating what was in front of them, accumulating the slow complexity that nothing could manufacture and nothing could rush. She watched them through the kitchen window for a moment. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went back to work. Edna Pruitt was not what Maeve had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. A widow struggling with tax payments and a property going to seed, the image that phrase produced was a particular kind of defeated quietness, a woman diminished by circumstances. Edna was 64 years old and met Maeve at the door of her farmhouse with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit for longer than Maeve had been planning it. "Celia Vasquez told me you might come," Edna said. "I should have known," Maeve said. "Come in, I've got coffee on." The house was clean and sparsely furnished in the way of someone who had sold things to cover costs but maintained dignity about the process. The kitchen table had a deep scar along one edge that had been sanded smooth, not repaired, just made acceptable. Edna poured coffee without asking how she took it, and sat down across from her with the directness of a woman who had decided some time ago that social ceremony was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You want to use my East Hillside?" Edna said. "I want to talk about it." "Talk then." Maeve laid it out plainly. She was looking for additional pasture with oak coverage for a managed feeding program. She had a buyer in Sacramento requiring supplies she couldn't meet on her current land. She was not looking to purchase Edna's property outright, not because she didn't want it, but because she didn't have the capital and wouldn't pretend otherwise. What she was proposing was a use arrangement. Maeve would run animals on the Pruitt East Hillside under the same management system she used on her own land, handle all the fencing and water work, and pay Edna a per-animal fee for every hog that completed the program on her property. Edna listened without interrupting. When Maeve finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "My husband ran pigs on that hill for 20 years, she said. "Fed them corn and turnips, same as everybody. I always thought the acorns were going to waste." "They were," Maeve said. "He would have argued with that. He would have been wrong." Edna looked at her with a kind of sharp appreciation. He was wrong about a number of things. He was a good man, but he had his opinions about how things were supposed to be done, and he held them longer than the evidence warranted. She set the cup down. "What's the per-animal fee?" Maeve named a figure. It was fair, and she said so and explained why. She walked Edna through the expected revenue per animal from the Aldi's arrangement and the margin she was working with, and what portion of that could reasonably go to land use without compromising the operation's ability to sustain itself. Edna followed the numbers without difficulty. "You could offer me less," Edna said. "I'm in a position where I'd probably take less." "I know," Maeve said. "I'm not going to do that." A pause. Outside, a crow was making noise in one of the yard trees, insistent and tuneless. When would you want to start? Edna asked. After I've walked the property and checked the water situation. The animals need reliable water across the rotation. If the spring on the east side is running reliably, I can probably start moving animals within 2 weeks. The spring's been running since before I was born, Edna said. It ran through the drought year my husband said was the worst he'd ever seen. It'll run. They walked the east hillside that afternoon, both of them, in the mild April light. The oak coverage was everything Celia had suggested. Mature trees, heavy canopy, the ground underneath soft with years of accumulated leaf fall, and the particular sponginess that indicated genuinely healthy soil. Maeve stopped at 2 points and crouched to look at the ground closely, pressing her fingers into the layer of decomposing matter. Her father had written about soil as the beginning of flavor. Not the soil that the animals ate, but the soil that produced the plants that the animals ate, the foundation below the foundation. She had always found that passage slightly abstract. Crouching here on Edna's hillside with good soil under her fingers, she understood it more concretely than she had before. The spring was exactly where Edna said it was and running exactly as she described. Maeve checked the flow rate and the water quality, clear, cold, no discoloration, and noted the natural drainage patterns. The fencing would need work on the northeast corner, but the basic infrastructure was there, laid down by Edna's husband and holding better than it had any reason to after years of no maintenance. This is good land, Maeve said, standing on the crest of the hill with the afternoon light running across the valley below them. I know it is, Edna said, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has lived somewhere long enough to understand its actual worth rather than its assessed value. They shook hands at the bottom of the hill, and Maeve drove home with the notebook open on the seat beside her, adding to her running list of what needed to happen and in what order. The expansion to the Prewitt land changed the scale of what she was managing, and scale changed everything in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. Not bad ways, but ways that required constant adjustment. She was now moving between 2 properties daily, supervising animals in 3 different management stages simultaneously. The early program animals still building on the hillside, the mid-program animals in the closer pasture rotation, and the finishing animals approaching processing readiness. Each stage had its own requirements and its own indicators, and keeping accurate track of 40-plus animals across 2 properties was a different cognitive task than managing the original 39 in one location. She started keeping a master chart on the kitchen wall. It wasn't elegant. It was a large piece of brown paper she'd got from Dunner's wrapping supply, covered in columns of her own shorthand. Celia had looked at it the first morning and added 3 columns of her own without asking, in a different colored pencil, and that had become the permanent arrangement. Ramon occasionally added notes in Spanish that Maeve had learned to decode based on context, and the few words she'd picked up from Celia. The chart was, she thought sometimes, its own kind of document, not the formal record of her father's journals or the analytical precision of her temperature logs, but a daily working map of a living operation that changed every morning. Dorothea saw it during one of her visits and stood in front of it for a long time. Your father would have done something like this eventually, she said. He thought about systems, but he worked in books. You work in space. I work in whatever fits, Maeve said. That's not the same as whatever's available, Dorothea said. You know the difference. It was, Maeve thought later, a more precise observation than it appeared. The trouble with Pettis arrived in May. Warren Pettis was the rancher whose conversation at the feed store she had chosen to ignore in March, and he was now in the process of demonstrating that choosing not to respond to a thing was not the same as the thing going away. He had apparently spent the intervening weeks telling anyone who would listen that the arrangement Maeve had with Aldous was either misrepresented on her part or misunderstood on Aldis's, and that the product she was selling was functionally indistinguishable from conventional smoked pork with an inflated price attached to a story. She heard this from 3 different sources in the space of a week. The first was Ramon, who had it from a laborer he knew at the Pettis operation. The second was old Sigrid Olsen, the dairy woman, who told her flatly and without editorializing during a buttermilk delivery. The third was Dorothea, who arrived one Tuesday morning with the look of someone carrying news they'd rather not carry. Pettis has been talking to the Mineral Springs Hotel, Dorothea said. He's offering them smoked pork at 2/3 your price. Says his product is equivalent. Maeve was sharpening a knife. She kept sharpening it. Is his product equivalent? It's grain-fed and finished in 3 months, smoked for 8 hours over green wood. Then it's not equivalent. I know that, you know that. Fourchette knows that. Dorothea sat down. The hotel purchasing manager may not know that, and Pettis is making a confident argument. What's Fourchette saying? He's holding, but he's also asking if you can supply more consistently, because if you can, the price differential becomes easier to defend to the owners. Maeve set the knife down. This was the pressure point she had been aware of as a theoretical problem and was now experiencing as a practical one. The quality she was producing was real and documentable, but quality in food was only as defensible as the buyer's ability to taste the difference. And buyers who were making purchasing decisions under cost pressure didn't always eat what they bought. They read numbers and listened to arguments. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She sent a note to Fourchette asking if he would arrange a comparative tasting. Fourchette's product and Pettis's product, prepared identically, served without identification. She would provide her samples. Pettis could provide his. Let the kitchen staff and the hotel management eat both and say which was which. Fourchette's response came back in 3 days. Arranged for the 15th. You'll need to be there. Aki. She drove to Mineral Springs on the 14th and stayed at a boarding house that cost more than she preferred to spend. She brought a full ham and a shoulder section from the most recent batch, wrapped carefully for the 3-hour journey. She also brought her notebook, because she had found that having it in her hand in unfamiliar situations gave her something to do with her attention that wasn't visibly nervous. The hotel was called the Meridian, and it was the kind of establishment that had aspirations toward the architectural language of the East Coast. A wide porch, painted cornices, a dining room with actual tablecloths. Fourchette met her in the kitchen, which was where he was always most comfortable, moving with the confident economy of someone for whom this space was natural territory. Pettis sent his product this morning, he said, without greeting. I've kept it separate. Neither product is identified to anyone on the staff. Did he know about the comparison? He was told there was a quality evaluation being conducted. He didn't ask the details. He should have asked the details, she said. Yes, Fourchette said. He should have. The kitchen had 6 people in it, plus the hotel manager, a man named Carwell, who wore a good coat and had the slightly over-precise diction of someone who had worked hard to acquire it. Carwell looked at her with the polite skepticism of a man who had been told this was important and had decided to reserve judgment until he had evidence. The tasting took 40 minutes. Fourchette prepared both products identically. Thin slices, no accompaniment, plain bread on the side to clear the palate. He served them in rotation, 2 samples per person, designated only as A and B. He stood back and watched with his arms crossed. She watched too, from a position near the door where she could see faces without being obvious about it. She watched the kitchen staff first because they were less guarded than the management. A woman at the far end of the preparation counter who took the first bite of A with the professional neutrality of someone who tasted many things and formed opinions slowly, and then took the first bite of B and looked up. Not dramatically, just looked up. The way you look up when something interrupts your train of thought. That was B. That was hers. By the end of the 40 minutes, the staff had identified the same product as preferred, 7-1. Carwell had asked for a second piece of B and eaten it slowly, and when Fourchette finally identified which was which, the hotel manager sat with that information for a moment. The price difference, he said, is justified, Fourchette said. The Pettis product isn't bad, Carwell said carefully. No, Fourchette said, it isn't bad. It's exactly what it is. Carwell looked at Maeve. How consistently can you supply this? I have a second property in the program now, she said. My supply timeline through fall is... She opened the notebook, though she had the numbers memorized. Old habit. It looked more considered, less like recitation. 2 batches by midsummer, a 3rd in early fall. Volume is limited but consistent. I want to discuss a standing arrangement, Carwell said. I'd like that, she said. On the drive back the following morning, she allowed herself a small and private satisfaction that had nothing to do with Pettis and everything to do with the woman at the end of the preparation counter who had looked up. That involuntary look, the moment when a person encounters something that requires their full attention without expecting to, was the thing her father had been trying to describe in all those journal pages. Not market share, not revenue, The moment when someone tasted the difference that patience made. She had built the thing he was describing. It existed. June arrived with heat and with complications. 3 of the Priwit animals developed a lameness issue that turned out to be a combination of the rocky terrain on the upper hillside and a minor nutritional gap she identified after 2 days of careful observation and the kind of frustrated middle-of-the-night thinking that produced solutions you couldn't reach through daytime logic. She adjusted the mineral supplementation in the buttermilk mixture, a small change, precisely calibrated, and moved those 3 animals to the flatter lower section for 2 weeks. All 3 recovered. She wrote it down in detail because this was the kind of operational knowledge that took time to accumulate and cost something each time you had to relearn it. She also, in June, had the conversation she'd been expecting with Aldous about Sacramento. He came in person rather than by letter, which told her the conversation was more complex than a routine supply update. He arrived on a Tuesday, accepted coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with the master chart visible over her shoulder and got to the point quickly, which she appreciated. "I've got 3 hotel clients and 1 large restaurant in Sacramento who want product," he said. "Not sample quantities. Regular monthly supply, consistent volume. The restaurant alone would take everything you're currently producing." She looked at him. And I have a business partner who is prepared to invest in expanding your operation significantly. New land, additional infrastructure, hired staff. He would take a stake in the business in exchange for the capital. She had known something like this was coming, had known it since his first visit when he'd said the Sacramento market would want more than she could currently produce. She had been thinking about it in the background of everything else for 2 months. "What stake?" she said. 40%. "No." He didn't look surprised. "What number works for you?" "No stake, not from an outside investor." She said it clearly and without apology. "I understand what you're offering, and I understand the logic behind it. If I take outside capital for a stake, the decision-making about quality and pace moves off this property. Slowly at first. Maybe not obviously, but it moves. This operation runs the way it runs because I control every variable. The moment someone with 40% has a cash flow expectation, the variables start adjusting to meet that expectation instead of to produce the product." Aldous was quiet for a moment. "That's a real concern," he said. "I know it is. It's the reason I won't do it." "Then you're limiting your growth." "I'm limiting my growth to what I can sustain without compromising what I'm selling." She paused. "Which is what makes what I'm selling worth buying." He leaned back, looked at the chart on the wall, looked at the notebook on the table between them. "There's another structure," he said slowly, "one where the capital relationship is a loan, fixed term, fixed rate, no equity. You pay it back from revenue, I take no stake, and you remain entirely in control of operations." She looked at him. "That's a different conversation." "It is." "What rate?" He named a figure. It was reasonable. Not generous, but reasonable, reflecting a genuine risk calculation rather than an attempt to extract. "I'd want the terms in writing," she said, "and I'd want the right to prepay without penalty." "I'd expect both of those things," he said. They spent another hour going through the specifics. By the time Aldous left, there was no signed agreement. She wanted to read anything carefully before signing and told him so. But there was the shape of one, and the shape was workable. She sat at the table after he rode away and thought about her father, about the journals and the 20 years of circling, about the gap between having an idea and having the capacity to build it into something real. Her father had run out of capital at the precise moment he was closest to the thing he was trying to build. She had found records of 2 loan applications in his papers, both denied, both from local lenders who hadn't seen what he was doing as a viable operation. She was not going to make the same decision he'd made because she had different options in front of her, but she was also not going to let access to capital change the fundamental character of what she was building. That was the line. It was the only line that mattered. She opened the journal to the page her father had written. "The flavor lives in the fat. The fat lives in the feed. The feed lives in the land." Below it, in her own hand, she had written an addition months ago, in a late night that she barely remembered now. "The land lives in time, and time answers to nobody." She closed the journal, got up, and went to check the evening feeding. The 3rd batch processed in late June, and it was the largest she had run. 14 animals, 8 from her own program, and 6 from the Prewitt hillside. The Prewitt animals had finished on schedule and ahead of the quality curve she had projected, which confirmed what Celia had told her about the acorn yield on that hillside. There was a specific density to the marbling on the Prewitt animals that differed subtly from her own. Not better or worse, she decided, but distinctly different, reflecting the character of that particular hillside's feed profile in the same way that 2 wines from neighboring properties shared a family resemblance while remaining distinct. She noted this carefully. It was a complication and an asset simultaneously. Complication because consistency was important to a commercial buyer, asset because it suggested the possibility of genuine product distinction within the same operation. She filed the thought for later. The smoke ran 26 hours, the longest batch yet. She and Celia traded shifts again, and at 3 in the morning, during her shift, she sat on the stool in the barn doorway and listened to the quiet of the summer night. The fire in the smokehouse was at its long middle stage, the temperature holding steady in the range she wanted, the smoke running the color she'd learned to read the way weather readers read clouds, with confidence that was really just accumulated experience wearing a calm face. Somewhere on the hillside, one of the animals moved through the dry grass with the soft sounds of nighttime foraging. Unhurried, patient, doing the thing it did. She thought about Pettis for a moment, about the particular kind of contempt that had been in his voice at the feed store, and what it had felt like to hear it, and what it felt like now. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the specific neutrality that comes when someone who dismissed you has become genuinely irrelevant. She thought about her father on this same property. On some night in some years she would never know. Maybe sitting outside the same smokehouse he had never quite managed to run properly, looking at the same hillside, holding the same idea that had not yet found the conditions it needed to become real. She thought, I finished it for you. Then she got up and checked the fire and wrote down the temperature and the time, and the night continued in its ordinary, necessary way. The loan agreement with Aldous arrived by courier in the first week of July. 12 pages written in the careful legal language of a man who had been in commercial arrangements long enough to know that friendly understandings had a way of becoming unfriendly disputes when money got tight. Maeve read every page twice, made 3 notes in the margin, and sent back 2 requested modifications. The prepayment clause needed stronger language, and one section about product delivery timelines gave Aldous more leverage over her processing schedule than she was willing to concede. He accepted both modifications without argument, which told her he had expected them. She signed on a Thursday morning with Celia and Dorothea present, not as witnesses to the legal document, but because they were there working and it seemed wrong to do it in private when they were as much a part of what the money was going to build as she was. Neither woman made anything of the moment. Celia kept sorting the morning's feeding supply. Dorothea was mending a piece of harness at the kitchen table and looked up when Maeve set down the pen and said, "Done," and then went back to the harness. That was the right way to handle it. Not ceremony, just the next thing in a series of necessary things. The capital went to 3 places in the first month. The largest portion went to fencing and water infrastructure on a 3rd property, 46 acres belonging to a man named Court Wills, who had been trying to sell outright for 2 years without finding a buyer, and who agreed to a use arrangement similar to the Prewitt deal when Maeve explained the terms. The Wills land was on the other side of the creek from her own property, lower elevation, different oak variety, different grass composition. She had walked it 3 times before deciding, and what had decided her finally was not the acorn coverage, which was adequate but not exceptional, but the creek bottomland grass that ran along the eastern boundary. A mix of native species that her father had written about in his earliest journals as ideal forage for animals in the middle stage of the program, when they needed something different from the dense acorn feeding of the later stage. She was, without having entirely planned it this way, building an operation where different properties served different stages of the animal's development. Her own hillside for the finishing stage, because the oak coverage was the best. Prewitt for the critical mid-stage. Wills for the earlier pasture work, each property contributing something specific, the animals moving through them in sequence, accumulating the complexity that the final product required. Her father had sketched something like this in one of his later journals, a theoretical model he called a feeding landscape. The idea that an animal's flavor biography could be shaped by moving it deliberately through different environments at different stages. He had written it as speculation, as a thing someone might someday try. She was doing it. It had happened incrementally, through the pressure of practical decisions rather than the execution of a grand plan, but the shape of it was unmistakably his. She wrote in her own journal, "Not all of what we inherit arrives labeled." The second and third portions of the loan went to equipment and wages. The equipment was a second smoking chamber, not a replacement for the stone smokehouse, which she intended to keep operating as the primary production unit, but a supplementary structure that would allow her to run 2 batches on overlapping timelines and increase output without the single-point bottleneck that the original smokehouse created. She had designed it herself, based on the original's dimensions with modifications she had identified through 18 months of operational learning, and she hired a mason from Callaway Flats named August Ferber to build it. Ferber was 60 years old and had a reputation for slow, meticulous work that produced structures that lasted. He looked at her drawings for a long time at the initial meeting and asked 4 questions, all of them specific and intelligent, and she answered them directly, and he said he would start the following Monday. He did. He worked alone, the way serious craftsmen sometimes prefer, and he was on the property every day for 3 weeks, building with a care that she recognized as a close cousin to the care she brought to the smokehouse work itself. On the second week, he stopped her as she was walking past with the morning feed barrow. "The damper mechanism on your original house," he said. "You fabricated it yourself?" "Yes." He looked at her with the assessing expression of someone who has spent a life understanding how things are built. "Where did you learn the metalwork?" "My father. He taught me enough to solve problems." "He taught you more than that." Ferber turned back to the stone he was setting. "I'll build the same configuration on the new one." "I'd appreciate that." The wages went to 2 additional workers. One was a young man named Dix Calhoun, who was 19 and had been doing odd jobs around the valley since leaving his family's failing farm the previous year. Ramon had recommended him, which was enough. Dix was quiet and diligent and had the particular quality of physical stamina combined with attentiveness that made him useful in ways that went beyond raw labor. He noticed things and reported them without being asked to, which in an operation where daily observation of the animals was the primary quality control mechanism was more valuable than strength. The second hire was Nora Vasquez, Celia and Ramon's eldest daughter, who was 17 and had grown up watching her mother work at the farm, and had, according to Celia in a characteristically understated observation, been doing the record-keeping in her head for 6 months already. Maeve gave Nora the master chart on the kitchen wall as her specific responsibility, and within 2 weeks the chart was more accurate and more detailed than it had ever been, organized in a logic that Maeve understood immediately as an improvement on her own system. "Where did you learn to organize information like this?" Maeve asked her. Nora looked at the chart. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just kept thinking about what you needed to know and what order you needed to know it in." "That's how your mother learned to work the smokehouse," Maeve said. "She didn't learn it either. She just understood the logic of it." Nora considered this. "She said you're the same way." "She did? She said you think the way the operation needs to think." Nora paused. "I didn't completely understand what she meant when she said it. I think I do now." The Sacramento arrangement formalized in August. Aldous had brought the restaurant buyer and 2 of the hotel purchasing managers to Callaway Flats in late July, a visit she had prepared for with the same careful attention she gave to the smoking process, which meant she had prepared the property and the product, but had not prepared a presentation, because she had decided that the thing spoke for itself or it didn't, and staging something to speak for it would only introduce noise. She showed them the operation the same way she showed everyone: walking the land, explaining the feeding stages, opening the smokehouse, letting them eat. The restaurant buyer was a woman named Clara Marsh, which surprised no one more than Warren Pettis, who had apparently heard she was coming and made a point of positioning himself at the feed store when her coach passed through Callaway Flats. Clara Marsh was 38 years old and ran the provisioning for 3 of Sacramento's most established eating establishments, with an authority that came from knowing food at a level that made her largely immune to persuasion and entirely responsive to quality. She ate a piece of smoked ham in Maeve's cold room, standing in her good traveling clothes without apology, and said nothing for almost a minute. "What are you charging Aldous per pound?" she said finally. Maeve told her. "That's not enough," Claire said. "Not for Sacramento. Not for what this is." Maeve looked at her. I set those terms because they're what the supply relationship required at the volume I could commit to. Renegotiate. Clara said it the way she probably said most things, not as a suggestion. You're underselling it because you're thinking like a frontier producer selling into a regional market. This product belongs in a different conversation. What conversation? The one where San Francisco buyers are sending agents to Sacramento to secure supply for the Occidental and the Palace. Clara set the piece of ham down with the careful deliberateness of someone who has eaten many things and knows when something is different in kind rather than degree. I know 3 buyers personally who have been looking for exactly this quality profile for 2 years. Maeve thought about the loan, about the Will's land, about the 2 women and 3 men who now worked at the operation and whose wages came from revenue that was already committed in the planning. I can discuss San Francisco supply in 6 months, she said, not before. Why 6 months? Because I'm not going to commit to a supply relationship I can't sustain. If I tell you 6 months, it's because in 6 months, the 3rd property will be fully operational and I'll have accurate numbers for what I can actually produce consistently. She paused. I'd rather give you a real number in 6 months than an optimistic one today. Clara looked at her with an expression she'd seen before. The fourchette look. The Aldi's look. The particular quality of assessment that experienced people produce when they encounter someone operating on a different principle than they expected. All right, she said, 6 months, but I want first conversation. You'll have it. The formal supply agreement with the Sacramento accounts was signed at the end of August, and the revenue it represented changed the arithmetic of the operation in ways that Maeve felt more as weight than as relief. Weight because supply commitments were promises, and promises made in food were promises that existed on a different moral register than promises made in goods that could be adjusted or substituted. She had committed to a quality and a consistency, and the only thing standing between that commitment and failure was the daily, unromantic labor of maintaining every variable at every stage. She wrote the supply numbers on the kitchen wall next to Nora's chart, not to celebrate them, to keep them visible as a daily accounting of what was owed. What? In September, Dorothea had a fall. It happened in her own yard, on a Thursday morning. She caught her foot on a root she'd stepped over 1,000 times, and went down hard on the stone path and broke her left wrist and bruised 3 ribs. She was alone, got herself up, walked inside, and splinted the wrist herself with 2 flat pieces of wood and a length of cloth before sending her nearest neighbor's boy with a note to Maeve. Maeve drove over within the hour and found her sitting at her kitchen table with the self-contained composure of someone who was in significant pain and had decided not to be theatrical about it. She got Dorothea to the doctor in Callaway Flats by midday. The doctor confirmed the fracture and the ribs and said she needed to rest completely for 3 weeks and carefully for 3 months. Dorothea on the drive back said nothing about herself. She said, "The smoke on the next batch, you need to watch the damper on the new chamber more closely than the original. The stone is younger, and it's still settling. The temperature will drift more than you're used to." "I know," Maeve said. "I've been watching it. Ferber built it right, but it needs a season to stabilize." She shifted slightly and controlled a wince. "Also the Prewood animals in the upper section. 3 of them are favoring the creek side of the pasture. I noticed it last week. Might be the forage in that section is running thin. I'll rotate them." "I should have told you sooner. I meant to write it down." "Dorothea." Maeve glanced at her. "Stop." A pause. "I'm going to be useless for weeks," Dorothea said, and the flatness in her voice was the closest she ever came to distress. "You're not useless. You're injured." Maeve turned onto the east road. "You'll come to the farm when you can sit comfortably in the wagon. You can supervise from a stool." "I don't want to supervise from a stool." "Then you can complain from a stool. Either way, you're still useful, and I'm not managing this without your opinions." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the flatness had shifted to something that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. "Your father used to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Make practical cases for emotional things, so you didn't have to acknowledge the emotional thing directly." She looked out the window at the passing road. "He was better at hiding it than you are." Maeve didn't say anything. "That's not a criticism," Dorothea added. "Yeah. The fall brought its own problems, which was the nature of fall in the high country. Not one large problem, but a dozen medium ones arriving in sequence without sufficient space between them to fully resolve any before the next appeared. The Wills Creek bottomland, which had performed exactly as the early assessments suggested through the summer, developed a drainage problem in the October rains that flooded a section of the lower pasture and compromised the fencing along the creek boundary. She spent 3 days on the repair with Ramon and Dix, working in cold mud that got into everything, and the fence they built was functional but not as solid as she wanted, and she made a note that the following spring it needed to be rebuilt properly from the posts up. One of the Prewitt animals died. Not dramatically, not from anything dramatic, but from an infection in a leg wound that she had identified and treated, but that had progressed faster than she expected in an animal whose age meant a compromised recovery response. She had known, somewhere, that the older animals carried this risk. Knowing it and experiencing it were different things. She wrote it down and noted the indicators she had missed or underweighted because that was what you did, and because the animal deserved a more careful accounting than grief alone could provide. Nora, who had been present for the death and had handled it with a steadiness that surprised even Maeve, found her in the barn that evening writing the entry. "Does it get easier?" Nora asked. Maeve considered the question honestly. "You get better at doing the next thing. Whether that's easier depends on the day." Nora sat on the bench along the barn wall. She was quiet for a moment. "My mother said your father lost animals too, that he used to take it hard." "He did." Maeve kept writing. "He said once that the ones you lose teach you more than the ones that thrive. I thought it was something people said. I don't think that anymore." "Because it's true?" "Because it's true and people say it. Those two things can both be right." Nora thought about this with the visible concentration of a 17-year-old who is taking an idea seriously. "I think I understand," she said. The October batch was 12 animals, a number she had arrived at through careful calculation of what the Sacramento commitments required and what the program timelines allowed, not through any particular desire for that number. The selection process took her 4 days, longer than any previous selection, partly because the Wills animals were being assessed for the first time, and she needed a longer observation window to feel confident, and partly because she had become, over the past year, more precise in her criteria in ways she couldn't entirely articulate, but that showed up in the final product. Celia noticed, "You're rejecting animals this season that you would have passed 6 months ago," she said, not critically. "The standard moved," Maeve said, "because you can supply the demand without pushing the borderline animals?" "Partly." She looked at the 3 animals she'd moved out of the selection pen. "And partly because I know more. When you know more, you see more. When you see more, you can't unsee it." Celia nodded slowly. "My father used to grade oranges at a packing house when I was young. He started as a sorter. They all looked the same to him. After 3 years, he could grade by sight at a speed that the newer workers thought was impossible. He said the skill wasn't speed. It was that the categories had gotten real to him. He wasn't making a judgment anymore. He was just reading what was there." "That's it exactly," Maeve said. "He also got harder to live with," Celia said, "because he couldn't stop seeing the flaws in everything." She said it without humor or particular warmth, just as a piece of information that seemed relevant. Maeve thought about that later, in the evenings. About whether the standard that had moved in her work had moved in other directions too. She thought about the way she listened to people now, with a different kind of patience than she'd had before, but also a different kind of impatience, a quicker recognition of when something wasn't what it claimed to be. She thought about Pedis and the Mineral Springs comparison, and the specific feeling of watching the kitchen staff identify the difference without being told. She had built that difference through patience and precision. But precision had edges, and edges were not always comfortable to live with. Her father had been precise. He had also been genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that didn't require anything back. She was not always sure she had that. She was not always sure she had tried to cultivate it. She thought about this and wrote none of it down, because some things were not data. Tomasing. Clay Mercer came back in November, not with a business proposition this time. He came on a Sunday afternoon, alone again, and he had a different quality about him than the April visit. Less purposeful, more simply present, the way old men sometimes show up when something is on their mind that doesn't have a clean, practical expression. She gave him coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. The journals were stacked at one end. The master chart on the wall above was dense with Nora's precise notations. Mercer looked at it for a moment. "How many animals in the program now?" he said. "Across all 3 properties, 61 active." He absorbed that. "And you started with 47 at the Callaway auction." 47 old sows nobody else wanted," she said. Not to make a point, just because it was the accurate description. "I know what they were," he said. He turned the coffee cup. "I've been thinking about that auction, about what I said afterward to the men I was standing with." He didn't say what he'd said, and she didn't tell him she knew. "I want you to understand that I'm not a man who makes a habit of underestimating people." "I know you're not," she said. "You were making a conventional assessment based on available evidence. The evidence was incomplete." "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "I don't need it to be more than that." Mercer was quiet. He looked at the journals. "Your father was a man who had more in him than this valley ever found a use for," he said finally. "That's been on my mind since I was here in April. I've been thinking about what it costs a man to have something real in him that the world around him never quite believes in." She didn't answer for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of wind along the north wall. "He believed in it," she said. "That was enough for him to keep going." She paused. "Most of the time." Mercer nodded slowly. "I've got 8 more sows," he said. "Older breeding stock, same lines as the ones I brought you in spring. I was going to sell them before winter. I thought you might want them first." "What are you asking for them?" He named a price that was below what she had paid in spring. He knew what the animals were worth, and he was choosing to price them below that, and they both understood what it meant without either of them naming it. "I'll take them," she said. They finished the coffee. Mercer put on his hat and stood at the door for a moment before leaving. "The town's talking about you differently," he said. "Not all of them, but enough. You should know that." "It doesn't change what I'm doing." "No," he said. "That's why they're talking about you differently." He opened the door and went out into the gray November afternoon, and she watched him ride down the road until he was out of sight, and then she went back to work. The 8 Mercer animals arrived the following week, and Dix moved them to the Prewitt hillside for the start of their program, while Nora entered them in the chart with the careful attention she gave everything: their approximate ages, their source, their visible condition, the date of intake. The operation absorbed them the way it absorbed everything now, not with drama, but with the practiced ease of a system that had learned its own rhythms. Maeve watched from the hill fence as the new animals moved into the pasture and began almost immediately the serious business of investigating their new territory. Head down, deliberate, following whatever logic animals follow when they are assessing new ground, not hurrying, reading what was in front of them. She watched them for a while. Then she wrote down the date and walked back down to the barn. The letter from Clara Marsh arrived on the 2nd Monday of December, and it was longer than any communication Maeve had received from a business contact before. 4 pages, written in the same direct and economical style Clara used in conversation, which meant that 4 pages represented a significant investment of her attention. The substance of it was this. 2 San Francisco buying agents had approached Clara independently in November, both seeking consistent supply of the quality she had described in her reports to her restaurant clients. One represented a hotel group with 3 properties on the waterfront. The other worked independently, sourcing for 4 of the city's most established eating houses. Both had tasted the product through Clara's Sacramento connections. Both were serious. Clara had told them that the earliest conversation was 6 months out, as agreed, but she was writing now to give Maeve time to think because, as she put it, this is not a decision to make in the room when they're sitting across from you. This is a decision to make at home, alone, before they arrive. Maeve read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while the farm was still waking up around her. Nora had not yet arrived. Celia was in the lower barn. Outside the window, the December light was flat and pale, the kind of light that didn't commit to anything. She read the letter twice and then set it down next to her coffee and thought about San Francisco. San Francisco was not Mineral Springs. It was not even Sacramento. It was a different order of market, a different order of demand, and a different order of risk. The risk that came with stepping far enough outside the boundaries of what you had built that you could no longer see the edges from where you stood. She had watched that happen to other operations, not through malice or stupidity, but through the simple arithmetic of supply commitments made at a scale that outpaced the quality controls that made the supply worth committing to. She picked up her pen and wrote in her notebook. What does San Francisco require that this operation cannot currently give without changing what this operation is? She sat with the question for a long time. Dorothea came that afternoon, her wrist in a lighter splint now, and her movement easier than it had been in October, though she still favored the right side and would for months yet. She read Clara's letter without being invited to, the way she read everything that was left within reach, and set it down with the particular quality of silence that meant she had formed an opinion and was deciding whether to offer it. Say it, Maeve said. San Francisco will ask for more than you can produce without bringing in outside animals, Dorothea said. Animals you haven't raised, animals you don't know the history of. I know. And you won't do that. I won't do that. Dorothea nodded. Then the question isn't whether to pursue San Francisco. The question is how to build toward it honestly, on your timeline, not theirs. Clara gave me 6 months. Clara gave you 6 months to have the first conversation. She didn't say you had to say yes in that conversation. Dorothea picked up her coffee. The most powerful position you can be in that room, is knowing exactly what you can deliver and being willing to walk away from anything that requires more. Maeve had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it spoken by someone else had the effect of making it feel less like stubbornness and more like strategy. Those two things sometimes looked identical from the outside, and she had occasionally confused them in herself. I'm going to need to expand the breeding program, she said. Not buying in outside animals, breeding my own. Starting now, so that in 3 years I have a full line of animals raised from birth in this system. Dorothea looked at her. 3 years is a long time to make a buyer wait. I'm not making them wait. I'm telling them what I can actually supply for the next year and offering them the option to build a longer relationship on the correct foundation. She paused. If they want something faster than that, they'll find a way to replicate what I'm doing at lower quality and sell it in San Francisco anyway. I can't control that. I can only control what comes off this land. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up along the north ridge, the kind of December wind that carried real cold in it now and was not going to relent until March. Your father, she said slowly, used to talk about the long game in a way that sounded like consolation, like he was explaining to himself why things were taking so long. She set the coffee down. When you say it, it sounds like a plan. Maeve didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure it needed one. She drove to Sacramento in the 3rd week of December to meet with Aldous and deliver the final batch of the year. The November processing, 14 animals, the best she had produced. The product was wrapped and packed in the bed of the wagon, with the careful attention to temperature and transport that she had developed over a year of learning exactly how handling affected the final quality in ways that were small but cumulative. Aldous met her at the warehouse he used for distribution, and he walked through the product with the practiced efficiency of a man who had handled a lot of goods and knew how to assess them quickly. He had also, she noticed, brought someone else, a man she hadn't met, standing slightly back, with the observational posture of someone who had been asked to look at something and was doing exactly that. Marcus Webb, Aldous said. He manages procurement for the Waverly Group in San Francisco. I told him you were coming. She looked at Aldous steadily. You told me the San Francisco conversation was 6 months out. It is, Aldous said without apology. Marcus is here because he was in Sacramento already, and I mentioned you were coming. If you want to send him away, I'll send him away. She looked at Webb. He was in his 40s, lean, with the careful dress of someone who moved between formal and working environments regularly. He had the grace not to look eager. I have 15 minutes, she said. They stood in the warehouse, not at a desk, not in a formal arrangement, and she said what she could currently supply and at what volume and at what price. And she said that the conversation about San Francisco supply was premature until the middle of next year. And she said that anyone who wanted to build a genuine long-term supply relationship with Holloway Farm was welcome to that conversation at the right time, but that she was not interested in commitments she couldn't back with actual product at actual quality. Webb listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific and intelligent, and she answered them directly. Then he said, What's your breeding program look like? I'm expanding it. Animals raised in this system from birth, first full cohort ready in approximately 3 years. 3 years, he said. Yes. He thought about that. The Waverly Group has been in business for 40 years, he said. We understand 3 years. Then we'll have a conversation in 6 months, she said, and a more detailed one after that. And if everything lines up, we'll be talking about a supply relationship that begins in a year and grows as the breeding program matures. That's a slow arrangement, he said. Slow arrangements last, she said. Fast ones fall apart when the supply can't sustain the commitment. You know that better than I do. Webb looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized now. She had seen it often enough. The recalibration. The adjustment of an expectation that had arrived with one set of assumptions and was leaving with different ones. 6 months, he said. 6 months, she confirmed. She drove home in this cold December afternoon with the payment from Aldous in the lockbox under the wagon seat and the conversation with Webb sitting in her mind the way important conversations did. Not as a victory, but as a commitment made, a line drawn. A thing that would require her to continue being exactly what she had said she was. She had said it cleanly. Now she had to live it. She paid off the first third of the Aldi's loan in January. Not because it was due, the repayment schedule Aldous had set was more gradual, but because the revenue from the Sacramento accounts had run ahead of her conservative projections, and she had the money and she wanted less of it outstanding. Aldous received the payment with a note that said only, ahead of schedule. Good. She appreciated the economy of it. The loan repayment mattered more to her than she had expected it to. Not as a financial event, but as a clarification of something she had been carrying since she signed the agreement in July. Debt was not shameful. She had never believed it was. Her father had carried debt his whole life, and she understood it as a tool. But this particular debt had represented the first time she had accepted someone else's resources into an operation she intended to run entirely on her own terms, and the faster it resolved, the more clearly those terms were hers alone. She told nobody about the early payment except Celia, who noted it on the financial record she kept without comment. February brought the first of the breeding program decisions. She had selected 4 animals from the program to retain for breeding rather than processing. Not the highest quality finishers, because those were exactly what the supply agreements required, but animals whose physical characteristics and foraging behavior suggested that their offspring would be well suited to the demanding, patient program she was running. She was thinking 3 years ahead, which was a different kind of thinking than she had been capable of 14 months ago when she was operating batch to batch, season to season. Ramon built the breeding pen with materials she had sourced through the winter, a solid structure with better ventilation than the original barn allowed, and he did it with the unhurried competence that she had come to rely on as a fixed point in the operation's daily rhythm. When it was finished, he walked her through it, pointing out 2 details he had added on his own initiative: a drainage channel along the south wall and a modified gate latch that she hadn't specified. The drainage was in the original design, she said. I should have specified the gate. I've seen pigs open the old style in under a minute, Ramon said. These won't. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, which was his standard response to acknowledgement, and went back to the work. Spring arrived the way it always arrived in the high country. Not gradually, but in argument with winter. Warm days followed by cold nights, followed by warm days again. The land making up its mind in fits and starts. The Wills Creek bottomland recovered from the October flooding with the resilience of ground that had been doing this for longer than anyone had been farming it, and the repair fence Maeve and Ramon and Dix had built in the cold mud held through the freeze and thaw cycles without significant settling. She walked all 3 properties in the first week of April, alone, with her notebook. She did this methodically, section by section, the way she had done it since the beginning, not inspecting exactly, but reading. The land told you things if you were paying attention, and the things it told were not always what you expected. A spring that had been reliable all winter was running slightly lower than she liked, which she noted and flagged for monitoring. A section of the Prewitt hillside where the oak canopy was thinner than the surrounding areas was producing a ground cover that had changed subtly from the previous year. More grass, less native forb. She'd need to rotate differently through that section, or risk running the late-stage animals on a feed profile that didn't match her program. She wrote it all down. Small things, most of them. The kind of things that didn't matter if you caught them early and mattered quite a lot if you didn't. At the top of the Prewitt hillside, she sat on a flat rock for a while. From there, she could see her own property across the valley. The barn roof, the thin blue thread of smoke from the original stone smokehouse where Celia was running a maintenance fire to check a repair they had made to the flue. She could see the line of the creek, and beyond it the lower edge of the Wills land. 3 properties, 14 months of work, 61 animals currently in various stages of the program, 5 people employed with regular wages, 2 supply agreements in active delivery, and a third being carefully constructed. Her father had sat on this hillside, or one very much like it. She was certain of that, though she had no record of it. He had walked his own land and the neighboring land with his journals and his observations and his theory that nobody believed yet, and he had written it down, and he had not had quite enough time or money or support to build the thing he was describing. She was sitting on his hillside with his idea built underneath her. That should have felt triumphant, and sometimes it did. But what she felt more consistently, more honestly, was something quieter than triumph, more like the feeling of having paid a debt she hadn't known she owed. He had put something into the world, into those journals, into those 30 years of careful thinking, and it had needed someone to receive it and finish it, and she had been the one. That was not heroism, that was inheritance used correctly. She took out the last journal. Not the earliest one, but the last one. The one written in the changing handwriting of his final years. The one with the incomplete sentences and the questions that didn't have answers yet. She had been carrying it with her on these property walks for months. She opened it to the last entry, the one that ended mid-thought, where his hand had simply stopped one afternoon and not picked the pen back up again. The animal remembers its whole life in the end. That was where it stopped. She had thought about that fragment often. She had her own interpretation of it, arrived at through the work rather than through reasoning, that the flavor of the final product carried everything the animal had experienced, every season, every feed source, every cold night and warm afternoon, the specific oak varieties on specific hillsides, the mineral quality of specific water sources. Not metaphorically. Actually. You could taste the life in it if you knew what you were tasting, and Fourchette and Clara Marsh and Marcus Webb knew what they were tasting, and that was why this operation existed in the form it existed. The animal remembers its whole life in the end, and the person who raised it carefully, who managed every variable with patience and precision and a willingness to fail and adjust and fail again, that person's work was in there too, inseparable from the product, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. She wrote one line below her father's last entry, in her own hand, as she had never allowed herself to do in the earlier journals. Those she had kept separate as his, but this last journal she had decided sometime in the winter was different. It was a document that had needed finishing. Everything it was given, it kept. She closed the journal. Below her, from the direction of her farm, she could hear Nora's voice carrying on the spring air. She was saying something to Dix about the morning rotation, something pointed by the tone of it, and Dix was apparently arguing back because that was the dynamic they had developed, an ongoing low-level negotiation about method and priority that Maeve had decided was productive as long as it stayed below a certain volume. It was staying below that volume. The operation ran on these kinds of frictions, small disagreements between people who cared about the same thing, working themselves out through the daily evidence of what actually worked. She put the journal in her coat pocket and stood up and started down the hill. There was a moment, a few weeks later, that she would remember more clearly than the formal milestones, the loan repayment, the supply agreements, the expanding program. It was an ordinary morning in late April, entirely unremarkable in its circumstances, and it stayed with her precisely because nothing about it was designed to be significant. She was at the feeding stations on the home property, moving through the morning routine, and Celia was at the far end of the lower pasture, and Dorothea had arrived and was sitting on the bench outside the barn with her mended wrist still wrapped in her coffee in the other hand, watching the animals in the middle pasture with the focused attention she gave everything. Ramon was repairing a fence post at the east corner. Dix and Nora were at the Prewitt property doing the morning check. The sows in the middle pasture, 12 animals, mid-program, 6 or 7 months from processing, were doing what they always did in the morning, moving through the pasture with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of animals that knew their ground and were working it methodically. The spring grass was coming up young and green after the winter, and the acorn crop from the previous fall was still producing the last of its fermented residue along the base of the oldest oaks. The animals knew exactly where to look, Dorothea said from the bench. Come and look at this. Maeve walked over. Dorothea was watching one animal specifically, one of the original Mercer sows, the Whitfield line, now 8 months into the program and visibly different from when she had arrived. Not just in condition, though the condition was what any eye would catch first. Different in some quality that was harder to name. A settledness, a kind of accumulated presence that Maeve recognized and that she knew Dorothea recognized. "She's ready," Dorothea said. "2 more months," Maeve said. "I know, I'm not saying process her now. I'm saying look at what she is." Dorothea watched the animal move through the grass. When Mercer brought her here, she was what she was supposed to be, according to the system she'd grown up in. Now she's something else. "Something better?" Maeve asked. "Something more fully itself." Dorothea glanced at her. "That's what this operation does, if you think about it. It doesn't improve the animals. It gives them the conditions to become what they actually were." Maeve stood at the fence for a moment, watching. She thought about the 47 old sows at the Callaway auction, about the auctioneer's voice dropping through the prices while the ranchers looked at their boots, about the laughter she had heard on her way out of the stockyard, about Pettis and his grain operation and his 8-hour smoke, about Fourchette with his eyes unfocused, holding something in his attention that he couldn't name, about Clara Marsh standing in the cold room in her traveling clothes, eating a piece of ham and saying the price wasn't high enough, about her father in the field on a Tuesday morning with the wire tool still in his hand, about the journal on the kitchen shelf, finished now with one added line in 2 different hands. What she had built was not the biggest operation in the valley. It would never be. The Sacramento buyers and the Sacramento restaurant and the Waverly Group in San Francisco and the mining camps and the hotels and the merchants, they would all get less than they wanted, and she would hold that line as long as the line needed holding, which was as long as she was running this farm. But what they got would be exactly what she said it was. That was the whole of it, really. That was the thing her father had understood and had tried to build from the wrong angle for 30 years, and that she had built from the right angle by accident and stubbornness, and the particular kind of knowledge that you could only get by failing at something carefully enough to understand why you had failed. The world had opinions about old things, about animals that were past their prime, land that had been written off, ideas that had circulated too long without producing results. The world moved toward the fast and the young and the easily quantifiable, and it did this because most of the time that logic was sufficient. Most things did not require patience. Most things did not contain what these animals contained. But some things did. And the people who could see that, who could sit in an auction yard while everyone else looked at their boots, and understand that what was in that pen was not a collection of failed animals, but a collection of accumulated years, of slow complexity, of the kind of value that the world had simply not yet found the right system to recognize. Those people were rare, and the world was usually not kind to them in the meantime. Her father had known that. She knew it now, differently than he had. Not theoretically, not as a consolation, but as a fact she had built with her own hands and could stand on. She stayed at the fence for another minute, watching the Whitfield sow work her way along the base of the nearest oak with the patient intelligence of an animal that knew what she was looking for and was not in any hurry to stop looking. Then she pushed off of the fence post and walked back toward the barn, and the morning opened up around her. Celia's voice from the far pasture, the sound of Ramon's hammer at the corner fence, the blue line of smoke rising from the stone smokehouse into the clear April sky. Ordinary and ongoing and entirely, carefully hers.